Mrs. Grin, I'm Hindol Sengupta. I'm absolutely delighted. Today, my guest is a very special woman. She is one of India's preeminent historians. Meenakshi Jain's work focuses on India's Hindu history, and she's written many extremely well received books. She's also a recipient of the Padma Shri, one of India's highest civilian honors. She's been teaching for a long time, and many of us learned many things from the books that she has written over the years. She has just sent me very kindly her latest book, The Hindus of Hindustan, a civilisational journey. Here's the book. This is what it looks like. I've been reading the book with great interest. It's a beautiful cover, has the Devi Durga on top of it. And I invited Professor Jain to have a wide ranging conversation with me about many things that not only impact Indians, but also impact the world at large because of India's rise in the Committee of Nations. What is Indian civilization? Is it only Hindu civilization? How does this civilization interact with other civilizations? And what is its future? All of those questions with Professor Meenakshi Jain, one of India's preeminent historians, and also in her latest work, The Hindus of Hindustan. Thank you, Professor Jain.
Thank you so much for having me.
I want to begin, Professor, by asking you to talk a little bit about your latest book first.
Okay.
Why is it called The Hindus of Hindustan? And why only the focus on Hindus? What are you trying to convey? What is the message even in the name?
Yeah. Actually, this is, I think I need to clarify that I have 4 or 5 chapters dealing with the history of India from the 8th century onwards. That is when, according to me, the first major rupture occurs in what we call Hindu civilization or Indian civilization. I want to clarify that before the 8th century, India had witnessed foreign rule for many centuries. And large parts of northwestern India were ruled by foreign dynasties, foreign origin dynasties. But we have to understand why is it that we don't remember those centuries of foreign rule as disruptive of the heritage of this country. What is it that happens in the 8th century that marks a radical rupture from what had been happening before? So this broadly explains the title, but that is not to say that I have not discussed developments in India from the 8th to the 12th, 13th, 14th century. Now, you asked about the title. See, the title, the word Hindu, as you would know, was used by Persians because they never pronounced the word S. So it was beyond the Sindhu, and that became Hindu. And what my attempt has been in this book, it is very unfortunate that in the post-independence era, most of our leading historians have parroted the British colonial view of our past. So, one of the abiding themes of British historiography was that there was no India until we came.
That's actually repeated even today. That's where your work, for instance, connects with contemporary politics.
Absolutely.
This idea that there was no India before the British came, and some, of course, say before the Mughals came, this idea is parroted in contemporary Indian politics, not just in India, but people to do with Indian politics in other parts of the world repeat this entire trope even today. Why does this trope continue?
Why this trope continues? I think it's an attempt to deny that there was a coherent civilization in India which went back 5,000 years at least. Now, I just want to mention the first English administrator historian who wrote copiously on this was John Strachey. And he is the one, when he looked at the diversity of India, he could not understand what were the uniting features. So he said there was no India before we came. Now, this is something that has been taught post-independence in our school textbooks, that, there was no India. Whereas in my book, the opening chapters of my book show that there was very much an entity called India before the Mughal or the British advent. So I have discussed how, over a period of a couple of centuries, the framers of our civilization, they gradually came to know of the landmass of the entire subcontinent. And we have early expressions of the concept of political unity, for example, by Kautilya in his Arthashastra. I'm not saying that there was political unity in the entire subcontinent. At that early phase of our history, it was not possible given the limited means of communication, etc. But conceptually, the whole subcontinent was regarded as the setting of a Chakravartin king. So Kautilya in the Arthashastra says that from the Himalayas to the seas and from the eastern to the western ocean, it should have one ruler. There should be one ruler for this. So imagine articulating this ideal so early on. And after Kautilya, we have many, many people who talk about India as an ideal political unity. And apart from political unity, we have early expressions that it was a cultural unity. And, there is a scholar of that period who in the Atharva Ved says that Dharma stands on four legs. Dharma stands on four legs from the Himalayas to the seas and from ocean to ocean, which means that it is one cultural entity. Now, the beauty of this culture or civilization was that it embraced everyone within its fold. It did not try to, reject or exclude any viewpoint, any civilizational or spiritual heritage of any part of the inhabitants of this land. That is something that, is something that is not appreciated. And it is something that as historians and scholars living in independent India, we should bring this to the fore, that Indian civilization never excluded anyone from the lowest and the humblest, and whatever they believed in, Indian civilization elevated that to the regional and all India level. I can just give you the example of Jagannath. Lord Jagannath, as we know it, was actually worshipped under a tree by some tribal groups. That is well established, and a lot has been written on that. But over a period of time, Lord Jagannath became the defining feature of an Oriya identity. So from a tribal god, Lord Jagannath became identified with an Oriya identity, and the last stage, he became an all India deity.
So this is a very important point, ma'am. Allow me to just interject here for a
Yes.
moment.
Yes.
This is a very important point. In your first chapter of your book, when I was reading it, you give several such examples and sources, should I say, of people who describe the cultural unity that you just explained. You mentioned Panini, you mentioned Buddhist sources, you mentioned Katyana, you mentioned Bodhayana, you mentioned Patanjali, all names that people who are engaged with the study of ancient India would find quite familiar. Now, my question before we come to the specific point of Lord Jagannath is this. If these sources from Purusha Sukta onwards are so clear, and the study of ancient India has gone on for so many years, why do you think these sources were overlooked?
See, I cannot answer on behalf of the historians who have chosen to overlook these sources. I cannot imagine that they're not aware of them, but their motives for ignoring this, I can only hazard a guess. And that is that the entire thrust of their scholarship is to show India as a nation of oppression, fragmentation, and that there is no underlying theme. I don't think that any of the historians that I'm talking about has found anything worthy of praise, not a question of praise, but worthy of, describing with candor. What is the problem in describing, for example, the evolution of Jagannath from a tribal deity to an all India deity? And Jagannath is not the only one. You can give the example of Krishna. Krishna was a deity of the Abhira cult, and now he is the most revered deity all India. Look at the way Janmashtami is celebrated across all castes, creeds, and religion. So this is a theme that goes on getting repeated in all parts of India and over a long span of time.
Let's come to the specific example of Lord Jagannath that you mentioned. Um, of course, both Lord Jagannath and Lord Krishna, all of this has merged into a larger sort of worship of Lord Vishnu. All of these sort of have come together in the Indian
Yes.
consciousness, in India's Hindu spiritual consciousness, right? Explain to us how this happens. Like you explained that Lord Jagannath used to be a tribal deity, so to speak, and then sort of morphed into becoming the pivot of a Oriya consciousness, Oriya Hindu consciousness, right? And of course, the Krishna story is even bigger in a sense, right? So how does this work to you as a historian?
But one thing I want to mention when you mentioned the cult of Lord Jagannath, and I said that Lord Jagannath was first worshipped by some particular tribes.
Hmm.
Now, this is very important that when Lord Jagannath became a regional and a pan-Indian deity, and the temples began to be built around him, it is so important to note that the tribals who were worshipping Lord Jagannath were the ones who were allowed only to touch the deity. You see, even today, the priests, let me put it like priests, that's not the right word, but the people who tend to the deity.
Yes.
That means
Yes.
the people who, offer food to the deity, who look after his daily needs, they are the
Caretakers of the Vigraha, so to speak.
yeah. So they are the ones who were from the same tribes that were worshipping Lord Jagannath. So the point to
In an
note,
unbroken chain. The
yes,
same tribe, unbroken chain.
and they are not deprived of their deity. They remain the first people to cater to the needs of the deity, and the other priests, they take one step back and they tend to the prayers, rituals, whatever. So this is very important. Now you talked about, we know that in the Vedas, Vishnu was a deity, one of the deities of the Vedas. Now, this cult of Krishna, it is a cult that is absolutely fascinating. In the Chandogya Upanishad, we first come across the name Devki Putra Krishna. Now, Devki Putra Krishna, we don't encounter anywhere else in our civilizational, spiritual, cultural journey. There is only one Devki Putra Krishna. So the first time he's mentioned is in the Chandogya Upanishad. And Chandogya Upanishad also tells us the name of his teacher and what Devki Putra learnt from his teacher. And it is surprising that what Devki Putra Krishna learned from his teacher is exactly what he expounded in the Gita. So, now that is one important point. But as you mentioned, that so many people get amalgamated into this Vishnu cult.
You're essentially saying that even though there is diversity, there is always an underlying continuity if we choose to look a little more carefully. It is
Yes.
because we have chosen not to look carefully, or rather look carelessly, that we have not understood or haven't conveyed to people this underlying continuity. But this underlying continuity is the base.
Is the base. Along with underlying continuity is embracing everything that comes on your way. So the Krishna cult, it incorporated so many deities like Narayan, you know, uh, many other deities. And the last deity that it amalgamated was the deity of the Abhira tribal community. Now, the Abhiras, they were cowherds, and they revered a deity who was a cowherd deity called Krishna. Now, over a period of time, all these various trends uh, amalgamated into what we call the Krishna cult, or you can say Vishnu cult. But the important thing is that when we got to this amalgamating stage, what did we call this religion? We called this religion Vaishnava after Lord Vishnu. So we are amalgamating strands from very popular customs and traditions of the subcontinent, but we are not losing track of that all embracing, all arching umbrella of Vishnu. And so we call this Krishna cult, or whatever cult you want to call it, as Vaishnava, derived from the word Vishnu.
Let's move on. In your book, the other thing that you mention in your book, in your chapter on sacred literature, is that the abiding, unity in India was also consistently depicted in sacred literature. If you could
Yes.
take us through a little bit on that subject.
You see, I begin with the assumption that the framers of our civilization were not at the outset familiar with the entire landscape, because India was a very vast country. So when we want to understand our civilizational journey, it is very surprising that we find traces of it in the sacred literature. And I have begun with the Rig Veda, which talks about the Nadi Sukta. That is the first reference that we get to geographical features of the subcontinent. And the Nadi Sukta describes rivers, lakes in northwestern India and Punjab. So we can conclude that the framers of this hymn were familiar with that area. But we know that they went over the whole of India, and by 500 BC, this is the date that has been given by eminent historian Dilip Chakravarti. He's a very one of the leading historians of today. And Dilip Chakravarti says that according to my analysis and understanding, by 500 BC, the entire landscape was known to the framers of our heritage. So they had traversed. Obviously, there were no good means of communication. We don't know how they traversed, whether it was by foot or whatever. But by 500 BC, the entire landscape of India was known. And I've given the example of Shatpat Brahmana, which records the movement towards Eastern India. And we have the famous story of Lord Agastya, which mentions his journey to the south. So it is very possible to do a minute study of the text and to understand how we became aware of the entire landscape. It's a very fascinating journey, but people more qualified than me, like Dilip Chakravarti, have written extensively on this.
I want to also come to another point that you mention in your book about a fundamental harmony. I think you alluded to
Yes,
this a little while ago in our
yes,
conversation.
yes.
But you talk about how there was a fundamental harmony in Indian civilization, right? And where that harmony comes from. Talk to us a little bit about that.
You see, children who are brought up reading the modern school textbooks, they will get a picture that India's, so-called religions or sampradayas or whatever you want to say, they were always at war with each other. The Hindus, what we call Hindus today, were at loggerheads with the Buddhists were at loggerheads with the Jains, and so much else. So this is the picture that has been depicted and presented to us consciously, I would say, over the last 50, 60 years. But when you actually begin to study ancient India, you find very little evidence of religious strife. In fact, all the evidence that you find points to another direction. And I will give the evidence of that just now. But before I forget, I want to make one very important point. We have thought that Krishna worship is a North India phenomena, and Krishna was, associated with Mathura, etc. But one of the most important epigraphists in the British period, George Buller, he found an inscription in the Western Ghats, the Nana Ghat inscription. And he has written copiously on this. And he says the Nana Ghat inscription is among the most important inscriptions of India. And why does he say that? He says because he dates that inscription to the 2nd century before Common Era. That makes it more than 2,500 years. And that inscription says, the inscription records 18 Vedic yagyas that were performed by this family, which got the inscription inscribed. And then it says that we are devotees of Krishna and Balram. Now, this is absolutely astounding for two reasons. First of all, it shows that worship of Krishna had reached the Western Ghats at least by 2nd century BC. We don't know if there were other inscriptions which we have not found so far. That is one. Second, it talks about people who are performing Vedic yagyas, becoming devotees of Krishna and Balram. So this typical thing that we are taught that, Vedic religion was at war with the non-Vedic,
so to speak, yes.
And Krishna worship is regarded as a non-Vedic because Krishna does not figure in the list of Vedic gods. And here is this family which is saying that we have performed 18 Vedic yagyas, and it lists those yagyas, and then it says we are dedicating this inscription. So Krishna worship had spread to the Western Ghats. From there, we know that it spread to the Tamil region, where the Alvars did so much to popularize it, then the Acharyas, and it spread all over India. So this is one example of the epigraphic evidence, because epigraphic evidence is very difficult to reject. There is no tampering with it. It can only be interpreted in one particular way. And all these inscriptions have been interpreted by very eminent epigraphists well before independence. So, they cannot be cited that, Hindutva historians have, manufactured these inscriptions. Another inscription in that, so it shows absolute harmony between people who are performing Vedic yagyas and the cult of Vishnu, of Krishna and Balram. There is another inscription which we have found in Rajasthan. That inscription also says, that person who's donated that inscription says that, I have performed these many Vedic yagyas, and now I dedicate to Krishna and Balram. So this is very early epigraphic evidence, which talks about no conflict between people who are performing Vedic yagyas and also paying homage to Krishna and Balram. Now, the thing is that image worship, we are not sure of the fact of image worship in the Indus Valley period, though there are some people who say that the image of the priest king and the mother goddesses, they say that that is evidence, but we leave aside because that is an issue which has not been, it is still a contentious issue. But all historians and art historians are agreed that image worship began in Mathura at the same time as Gandhara. So image worship began at Mathura and Gandhara. And what is the importance of Mathura and Gandhara for image worship to begin here? Mathura and Gandhara were parts of the Indus Valley civilization. So if we assume that the priest king is an image, and those figurines, female figurines, are mother goddesses, then from Indus period till about 1,000 years, there is no evidence of continuity. What happened there? But suddenly image worship starts in these two areas, which were key areas of the Indus Valley civilization. This is a point which R.P. Chanda, he was a very, very important epigraphist and historian in the early modern period around the 1920s. And unfortunately, we have just forgotten him. So he is the first person who made this point that Mathura and Gandhara, they could have started anywhere else, but they started in this area. Now, to come to your second point, I said that image worship began in Mathura and Gandhara, but we'll leave out Gandhara, we'll concentrate on Mathura. So the Hindus, I'm consciously saying that Hindus is a word which is not used at that time, but I'm using it for short form. So Hindus, Buddhists, and Jains, image worship among them began at the same time in the same city of Mathura. And there were colonies of sculptors, image makers. So their services were offered to all three. It's not that the Jains had separate image makers, the Buddhists had separate. No. They had a colony and they all used to offer their services to whoever. Now, the images that were made, I want to talk about certain common features in all the images. You know what we call the sacred symbols? Like pad, footprints. So
even handprints.
So we have early evidence of footprints of Vishnu Pad.
Yes.
Buddha Pad. Buddha was also worshipped by his.
Yes.
For a long time, he was not depicted in images. So we have Vishnu Pad, Buddha Pad, and we have the same thing in the case of Jains. Then what about things like swastika?
Yes.
Were they only common to Hindus? No, they were common to Buddhists. Then what about,
As an aside, something that, even today creates and how the past and the present connect. Dr. Jain, of course, even today around the world, the misconception that the Nazis used the swastika symbol continues, even though voluminously it has been written, including, I have written, many others have written, that what they really use, Mein Kampf, Hitler's great autobiography, mentions the Hakenkreuz or the hooked cross. It never uses the word swastika.
Absolutely.
It was translated by the British when Mein Kampf was translated by the British. It is then when the British converted this Hakenkreuz into the swastika. This is the one of the greatest, in a sense, one of the greatest damages, cultural damages or wounds that have been inflicted, via translation, where the original never says something and it has been made into something else and it's still being used despite all the pushback. Maybe you can say something about that.
No, I think you have put it so well. I cannot better what you have said. So it's so eloquently put by you. And so now to make the points of cultural, the same symbols. People, even today you will find the gardeners will not cut a people tree because of the sacredness. Now in the Indus Valley, we have so many depictions of people on the, urns, etc. Buddha attained enlightenment under the people tree. So people is something. Is Ganesh only found in Hindu temples? Ganesh is found in the beginning of all Jain temples. He is recognized. Lakshmi. So these are common symbols that are shared because it is a shared spiritual tradition. So that is the first point that I make. Then, I also want to say that, leftist historians have depicted our culture and civilization as, a patriarchal one and, oppressing the women. And that the women are not given their due space and their due right. Now, I'm talking about the ancient period. What happens in the medieval and modern period, I do not discuss in this book. But I give the example of the ancient period, again from a Jain site near Mathura. And Jains used to make, because there was no image worship for a long time, so they used to make what is called ayag pattas. Ayag patta were almost the size of a mobile phone today, and they would have things like swastik, etc. They would be put under a tree or wherever, and people used to worship them. Now, 95% of these ayag pattas that have been found in Mathura were donated by women. And in many cases, the women had become Jains, but the husband still remained what we can call Hindus, for want of a better word for that period. So, all the evidence that I find from the ancient period, it flies in the face of what I have at least been taught in school. And just one more thing I want to say before you move on to your next question. We associate stupas with Buddha and Buddhism. But actually, the first stupas evidence that we have found comes from Mathura. It's a Jain stupa, and part of that has survived. And there is a beam, part of a building, a beam, and that also shows Jains venerating before a stupa. Now, the Jain stupas were so common and so like the Buddhist stupas that King Kanishka, that great Kushan king, who's supposed to have been a great patron of Buddhism, he once worshipped at a Jain stup thinking that was a Buddhist one. So that's a very well recorded evidence, and probably Jains thought that now we have to distinguish somewhat from the Buddhists, and they stopped making stupas. It is possible.
I just want to highlight that in your book, you give this wonderful image which stayed with me. Of course, this Ek Mukha Linga from the 9th century we've seen before. But what fascinated me was this image. This is a 5th century Ganesha found in Gardes in the Paktia province of Afghanistan. And you say that the inscription stated this great and beautiful image of Mahavinayaka, Ganesha, of course, consecrated by the Shahi king Kingala. It gives us a sense of the spread.
I'm so glad that you have raised this, because this is one of the very important highlights of my book. I'm so glad. Thank you so much. You see, according to my study and the study of non-Marxist historians before me, the frontiers of Indian civilization, we know that in the south it was till Kanyakumari, right. But in the north, the frontiers of Indian civilization, let me use that word, extended up till the Kabul Valley and beyond. And there is evidence of a Shaivite god called Zun. Zun was a Shaivite god worshipped in the Kabul Valley for a very, very long time. And we have eyewitness accounts of people going and worshipping Zun. There is also evidence of Devi cults. And as you mentioned, Vinayak and so many other deities. There is a very wonderful book that has been written by Andre Vink. And I have got these photographs from the net. But I found the references and found. So you can imagine that Indian civilization in the north was extending beyond the Kabul Valley. And as evidence, I am giving you the Zun was the Shaivite god, references to that, female Devi cults, these things, and of course, Buddhism. And, we have Yun Sang, the Chinese traveler, who came to this area and spent a lot of time here. And he writes, at that time, the Bamyan Buddhas were under worship. So he has presented, the images in all their finery, in all their glory, and how they were being worshipped. The story of the frontiers of Indian civilization contracting and retreating is a sad one. But again, it is well documented. The problem is that we don't look for the evidence. The Hindu Shahi rulers.
Yes. Please go on. Please go
on. The Hindu Shahi rulers actually had their capital at Kabul. Kabul was their capital. And when the Turkish invasions began, they went to the Salt Lake, then to the Indus, and then finally they reached Punjab. So it is just not correct to believe that the people who associated with this civilization did not die for it. This family, one family, 4 generations died, and they were kings. And they died for their civilizational heritage. They died for their deities. They died for their sacred structures and their sacred spaces. And one thing more, if I can add, many of these rulers who fought the Arabs and Turks, they actually documented their struggle in inscriptions. Because this area has seen so much warfare, much of that evidence has got lost, but fragments of inscriptions have survived, which document the resistance of the rulers of this region to defend their culture, their heritage against the marauders. Now, I just want to make one more point before I hand over the thing to you. Again, I'm repeating that India had experienced foreign rule before. The Indo-Greeks, the Bactrians, the Shakas, the Kushans, even the Huns, they all ruled over parts of India. But why is it that we don't record that heroic resistance that we find in the case of the Arabs and Turks? This is a point that is worth recording.
We'll come to that in just a moment, but I want to stay with the Hindu Shahis just for a moment.
Yes.
Very little actually in common discourse is understood or known about the Hindu Shahis. In fact, most people don't realize where the frontiers of Indian civilization or Hindu civilization really went to. And before the Islamic invasions, the frontiers of Indian civilization are not something that's certainly not in our popular discourse, not in our popular imagination. And certainly most people, I certainly was taught about this, and I don't think most people in India are taught about this.
Yes.
What do we not know about this frontier, as you call it? And I think that's absolutely the right word, of our civilization, which we should know much more about.
You see, the people who visited that region in that period, all their writing or many of their writings are available to us. So, we have, for example, I told you about Zun, Shaivite god, Devi cults, Buddha, etc., etc. So this was also, a place that was on the trade route, and we have many accounts that are available. I don't know why we have forgotten this episode. It's very difficult for me to answer, but I thought that it would be a matter of pride. And, just to take a big jump forward, when the Marathas, when they reached Attak, then it was celebrated as Diwali, because they said now we have an all India empire again that is stretching from Attak to Katak, was the way they put it. So I don't know why we have forgotten about it, but people of that time, after all this Marathas in the 18th century. So how many thousands of years have passed? I mean, more than 1,000 years, because the Hindu Shahis had their capital in the 8th century in Kabul. So for 1,000 years, that memory was there, and that going to Attak and getting hold of Attak was celebrated as Diwali. So that means that I don't know what happens, whether when a civilization is forced to retreat. These are questions that it's very difficult for me to answer. Do you deliberately forget
It's possible, yes.
parts of your
It's a bit
past?
like, people forget great trauma in their life.
Yes, yes,
The mind
yes.
sort of forgets that episode, so
Yeah,
that, you.
yeah, yeah.
And also, since you mentioned the Marathas, the other very interesting thing, to me, in my writings is that even the Marathas, in a sense, are something that we don't really delve into, apart from, of course, Shivaji, because we, in our classic sort of post-independence historical narrative, have essentially moved from the Mughals straight to the British, with just a nod here and there, maybe to Shivaji, and not even Maharana Ranjit Singh that much, but a little bit to Shivaji, and then we cut straight to the British, right? So there's
But
a whole chunk of
yes,
history there we know very little about.
yes. And the Marathas, they were an absolutely amazing story that we should remember. Imagine from the south, they are coming all the way to the north. But before that, before coming to the Peshwas, Shivaji, Chhatrapati Shivaji Maharaj, as he is rightly known as, he mounted such a challenge to the Mughal emperor that Aurangzeb had to live in the south for 25 years. Now, today, when we have, no dearth of means of communication, an aeroplane will take you in a couple of hours. But imagine at that time that the Mughal emperor is not visiting North India for 25 years. So the most important cause of the Mughal weakness and decline were the Marathas, because they made the emperor leave Delhi and live there. And it is absolutely astonishing that we don't even remember how powerful the Marathas were, that they made the Mughal emperor their captive. The Mughal emperor, they made their captive, and they kept him in custody. So is it because it deviates from the grandeur of the Mughals that we have been taught about? Is that one of the reasons why we do not focus enough on the Marathas? And one more thing I want to say about the Marathas. It is so overwhelming to know that most of the Maratha Peshwas, for example, the Peshwas were Brahmins. I know they were not Marathas, but they were heading a Maratha empire. All of them, they tried their best to win back Ayodhya, Kashi, and Prayag from the Nawab of Awadh, who controlled this area. And letters have survived of the Maratha rulers saying that we will give you this much money. We'll give you 50 lakhs if you give us this. We'll make you a vizier of the Mughal Empire if you give us this. So hectic bargaining is going on between the Awadh Nawab and the Maratha Sardars about reclaiming the sacred heritage. That also talks a lot about our civilisational memory.
Absolutely. And, of course, we remember Shivaji, but many great other Marathas, Kanoji Angre, for instance, the great general, the great,
Yes,
expert in sea warfare,
absolutely.
who really led an unbeaten
Yeah,
flotilla
yes,
of Maratha ships, and defended that coast.
yes,
All of this has been forgotten. I mean, Kanoji Angre is a legendary, in any part of the world, he would be a legendary, sea general, so to speak.
absolutely. Absolutely.
expert at oceanic warfare, but
Hmm.
we've forgotten. And of course,
We forgot.
Tanaji is another one which Ajay
Yes,
Devgan brought into our consciousness through his
yes,
films.
yes,
But there are
yes.
many such characters, it
Many,
seems to me.
certainly.
Even in Sikh history, Professor, we remember, of course, Guru Govind Singh, but we've forgotten people like Banda Bahadur.
Yes,
And I live in Delhi, where when I go up the Barapulla flyover, there is this statuette of Banda Bahadur, so I remember it every time. But we've forgotten Banda Bahadur, who in many ways is the Indian Hercules. Really strong, really a massive
absolutely.
warrior. Whose thought would send armies into palpitations of fear and so on and so forth. There's so much of these interesting anecdotal.
I just
Sort
want
of,
to add something on the six.
please, please.
I used to teach history at Delhi University,
That's right.
and the syllabus had teachings of Nanak and Kabir. That was the heading. There
Yes.
was no mention of any of the Sikh gurus. Now, it is very interesting that the lifespan of the Sikh gurus was coterminous with the lifespan of the great Mughals.
Right.
And the gurus, what problems they created for the Mughal Empire
Yes.
were documented in contemporary accounts, beginning with Jahangir talking about him ordering the capture of Guru Arjan because he was upset that ordinary Muslims were also attending his discourses. And that episode has been documented by Jahangir himself. Shah Jahan and Har Gobind, Aurangzeb, Guru Tegh Bahadur.
Of course, and the great, the murder of Guru Tegh Bahadur again in Delhi,
And
of
yes,
course, Guru Govind Singh after that.
yes. But one thing I want to say, that in the history textbook that was written at that time, uh, it is written after the death of Guru Arjan by Jahangir. These are the exact words. So a student who's 12, 13 or 14 years old, how will he know death by Jahangir means what? In ordinary English. So this was the extent to which, they covered up. And the way Banda Bahadur's followers were executed in front of him, and he was told that you convert, we will stop. And, again, there were two employees of the East India Company, the English East India Company, who had come to Delhi from Calcutta to request the Mughal emperor for some concession, trade concession. And they were the ones who were eyewitnesses. They saw this horrific thing. So we just forget.
Professor, and here's the interesting thing, many people, including, Janardhan Ganeri and others, have talked about the direction that events in history took. If Dara Shikoh had become emperor, for instance, there is this entire historical argument that things in the subcontinent may have turned out to be very different, right? Here was a man who at least made an attempt, on the banks of Kashi, as it were, to bring together, many knowledgeable scholars, have a dialogue between them, and so on and so forth, to try and understand the commonalities, and so on and so forth. Um, do you think that was, in a sense, a historical unknown, which we will, of course, never know, but which could have given a more peaceful, uh, history to the subcontinent?
This ifs and buts of history,
Sure.
uh, you know, one cannot talk about them with certainty because they're just ifs and buts. The point is that how many Mughal emperors before Dara? Dara was not an emperor, but how many Mughal emperors before him tried to continue that legacy of Akbar is something that we should also debate about.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Jahangir's autobiography is self-evident. Shah Jahan, there is so much work written in Persian, how he gave orders that no temple should be built in Banaras. 80 temples should be destroyed. All that is well documented in Persian accounts of that period. So, it's high degree of speculation, which there's no point actually in indulging in.
Move on then to a different sort of topic. Towards the end of your book, you talk about how early foreigners who came to India, in a sense, became not just people who recorded what they saw about the civilization, but many of them became part of the civilization.
Yes.
You talk a little bit about that.
Yes.
What do you mean by that?
Yes. As I said earlier, that India had seen foreign rule before that. And I've given the example of so many dynasties. And we have epigraphic accounts of how they completely immersed themselves in the Indic tradition and civilization. I give you the example of Rudra Daman Shaka. Rudra Daman Shaka, as his name clarifies, he was a Shaka. But the first inscription in Sanskrit is actually his handiwork. The Satvanas were Brahmins who were ruling around the same time, but their inscriptions of that period were in Prakrit. And Rudra Daman Shaka, he has this inscription in which he talks about his, achievements. He says that, I write Sanskrit kavyas, I write this, and how he talks about what he has done for, pilgrims, etc. What I'm just trying to say is that there is no evidence in the ancient period of any foreign ruler trying to impose his belief system on the people of the subcontinent. And I will give you, there's so many examples that I can give, but I will, for the sake of your readers, your viewers, I'll give an example from the Huns. We've all heard of Huns as terrific barbarians who burnt and looted wherever they went. So they had a bloody history. One cannot deny that. Mihir Kula was one Hun ruler who ruled over large parts of India. And it is surprising that Alexander Cunningham was the first director of the Archaeological Survey of India. Now, he has contributed so much to unraveling our heritage. So many sites he excavated. So in Gwalior, Alexander Cunningham found an inscription. That inscription recorded how Mihir Kula had become a follower of Shiva. So I don't think, to the best of my knowledge, that from the 8th century onwards, the people who ruled the subcontinent, whether they have left any epigraphic evidence of them embracing the culture that they found in the subcontinent. And certainly, there is no doubt that they tried to impose their religious beliefs on the populace. The thing is that, in the Sultanate period, there is a very, very important Persian work, because all this can be documented through Persian accounts. So Iltutmish is asked by the ulema that, the kafirs are only given an option of conversion or death. But why have you not done anything on that front? So Iltutmish's reply is also recorded in that text. He says, at the moment, we are like salt in a dish. Our number is so small. But when we become numerically stronger, we will certainly offer this option. So this refrain is there in the entire medieval period. And I'll give you one more example, Jalaluddin Khalji. His conversation is also recorded. And he says, how do you think I feel when I sit on my balcony and see Hindus dancing and worshipping their deities and taking them to the Ganga, to the Jamna? So, it is not without foundation, not without enough substantiation, that I make the point that the rulers who came after the 8th century were very different from the rulers who had gone before them. And since you have raised this point, I want to make one very important point. In the ancient period, there were so many tribes who were, and people who were coming. They were not necessarily all becoming rulers, but they were coming. So, in the ancient period, there is a lot of debate on how these people who are coming, how should they be treated. So, we have Manu dealing extensively with this matter, and after him, many others. Now, Manu says that there are only 4 classes, and the rest are descendants from them. The rest are the product of mixed marriages between one varna and another. Okay. So that means that they're all either the 4 varnas or the offspring of mixed marriages between them. This is Manu. And then he is asked, in the Mahabharata, there is a very interesting conversation between a person who was part of that Mahabharata dialogue, and he does penance because he wants to get sight of Indra. So finally, Indra does come before him, and he says that, what do we do with these people? How do we make sure that they become part of our society? What should they do? What purificatory rites should be made compulsory for them? Indra says, and this is a point that Manu had also said earlier, that they just have to begin to live like the rest of society. So Indra says in the Mahabharata, this sequence is there, that they have to just live like the rest of society, and then they become part of that society. So neither Manu nor any other lawgivers who came after him prescribed any Shuddhi or purificatory rites for tribes and communities that did not belong to the cultural stream of this country. They said that they just have to begin to live like the other inhabitants of this country, and then they become like them. So this attitude was something that, Al-Biruni, Al-Biruni came with Mahmud Ghaznavi, and he wrote one of the most important works of history of that period. And Al-Biruni notes that, they had such a open attitude. They welcomed and honored wisdom, whether it came from an Arya or a Rishi or a Malech. These are the words that Al-Biruni uses. And Al-Biruni gives the example of a person who came from outside, Varha Mihira. We revere him today also for his. And he says that, he was a Greek. And he is revered. Why should he not be revered? Because of his knowledge. Then this is something that is absolutely, something that we have just ignored. It was not a closed society. Then Al-Biruni himself offers the explanation why this society became so different. So he gives the example of Varhamir and he says that, the welcomed and revered knowledge, whether it came from an Arya, a Rishi, or a Malech. Then he says that, these are his words. He says, and then Islam came. And he writes over there, I'm quoting him, Hindus became like atoms of dust scattered in all directions. And that is why they fled to far off places like Kashmir, etc., where our arms could not reach them. If this is not enough of an explanation, Al-Biruni, he goes further. And he says that, he documents the arrival of a foreign creed into the subcontinent. And he gives the example of Muhammad bin Qasim, who invaded Sindh. And he says that, Muhammad bin Qasim was told that the wealth of Sindh is from this famous Sun Temple.
Right.
And people from all over India come here, and the kings often send tribute, etc. So Al-Baruni writes that Mir Qasim ordered a piece of flesh to be placed around the neck of the deity. So, Al-Baruni has given such a detailed account and explanation, and he says that, mothers would frighten their children if they were crying at night and wanting to put them to sleep to say, Mahmud Ghaznavi has come. This is what he's writing. So that sheer terror that India had not, experienced the ferocity of the attack. And it was not just a military attack, it was an attack on civilization and sacred heritage.
Culture. One of the most fascinating things that is coming out through this conversation, Professor Jain, is that there's this wonderful essay, Ramanujan's 300 Ramayans. How
Yes, yes.
Ramayan exists, and the story exists in so many versions and so many iterations and so on and so forth. And almost people misunderstand it, but I feel it's almost like a thread that goes through the entire country. This great story, right? And the sacred story from your conversation, you're pointing out not just 300, maybe so many others, points of unity, so to speak, and at a time when we are again, this idea of division is being pushed constantly through our media and so many other channels. You are talking in a sense about all the ways that there is civilizational unity in the country, isn't it?
I just want to make 2 points about the Ramayana and Mahabharata
Yeah.
that you were so kind enough to bring to this discussion.
Yes.
These epics,
Yes.
they tried to bring into the narrative people from all parts of India.
That's right.
And, in the British period, Father Camille Bulke, he tried to count how many variations are there of the Ramayana story, because every region has its own,
Yes.
that Ram came here and this happened and that
Yes.
happened. So he calculated 300 tellings of the Ramayana
Yes.
according to what he was able to gather. So this is, that the Ramayana or the Mahabharata, the epics, they did not try to exclude any part. They
Yes.
tried to bring in, and
Unity, yes.
and people also gave their own, because they also wanted to be included in that story.
That's right.
In the 10th century, by the way, there is an inscription that has been found of the 10th century, the Pandyan kingdom. All right. And in the 10th century, common era, that king's inscription says that we used to supply food to the Mahabharata army. Can you?
Fascinating.
It's fascinating. And the eye hole inscription of Pulakesin II, which is still there.
Yes.
It says something. It says that so many thousand years, it gives the exact amount, 3,000 so and so years have passed since the Great War. So I'm not saying that it is historically correct.
Yeah.
That's not for me to say.
Yes.
But that inscription actually records the number of years that have passed since the Mahabharata war.
But it gives a sense about how, as you were
Yes.
saying, everybody has ownership to these stories, right?
Yes.
So somebody says, like for instance, in the Northeast, there are parts which believe that, one of Krishna's brides came from there.
Yes.
Down south, there are places that Rama went to, and
yes,
this entire geographical unity is depicted in a sense in these great stories.
And as you say, and as I said earlier, no part of India or no community was kept out of these stories.
Correct.
It was to assimilate everyone.
Wonderful. On that wonderful assimilatory note, Professor Jain, I want to thank you for your time. One last thing. So, at a time when once again this message that, India was not a nation, India was never a civilization, India is maybe not even a nation, India's multiple nations put together, India is only a unity, all of these messages, in a sense, are sort of the drumbeat has begun again. It's important to remember that the fundamental cohesion and unity of Indian civilization not only is a matter of argument for historians, but there is enough and more concrete examples, whether it's texts, whether it's archaeological evidences, whether it's other facets and elements which showcase, which we can turn to understand this unity. Isn't that true?
Can I just make one last point?
Please, please.
In Great Britain, Ireland has broken away.
Yes.
Scotland wants to break away, and they're not having a referendum because of fear that it will break away.
Correct.
In India, can you tell me at any point in our history where, for example, Orissa said we are separate from India? We have nothing to do with India. It doesn't happen. There were different dynasties ruling over different parts of India, but they all claimed being part of the mainstream inheritance. I'll just give you one example. There is the Ishkwaku dynasty that ruled
over Rama's dynasty.
Yeah, it was ruling over Andhra.
Yes.
And it said that we are ancestors of Lord Ram, we belong to the same.
Yes.
So they never said, who's Ram? We have nothing to do with him. And the Chalukya dynasty, there is an inscription of that dynasty which has survived. I think it's called the Khatum inscription, in which that family claims, it's about the 9th, 10th century. It says 56 of our ancestors ruled over Ayodhya.
Oh.
And then we migrated to the south. So, I mean, there is no one
who doesn't claim part of this inheritance.
Yes. And all dynasties, the rulers of all dynasties, they said we are linked to some hero of the Mahabharata or someone from the Ramayana. So they were all dying to link themselves with this heritage. So it's a very, very valid point, and I'm glad that we are ending on this point.
Wonderful. I think, your wonderful book, and I want to hold up the book once again, The Hindus of Hindustan, the latest book of Professor Jain. Loved reading it. The Hindus of Hindustan, a civilisational journey. Great examples of how there is continuity and unity in ancient Indian history, but also beyond ancient Indian history are our great epics. And we are ending on that note that no matter who it is in India, they claimed a slice of our great epics, and those epics, therefore, also are fertile ground for us to understand our unity. Thank you, Professor Meenakshi Jain. Really appreciate your time today for talking to me. Thank you.
Thank you so much for inviting me. Thank you so much.